Even men at the top of their game find themselves wanting more from life. Whether it's more meaning, unshakable confidence, a bigger impact, more money, deeper love, a hotter sex life, or a powerful legacy. Find out how good your life can be on this episode of Man Alive. Also, as I've supported men in their love and work lives for 15 years now, many men have asked me for the right words to say to be more attractive, desirable, and more of a leader. And I've found it's not so simple as giving scripts or lines. Because at the root of a connected and affectionate relationship and being more effective and inspiring at work is your ability to influence others. But most often, influence is not gained or lost with words. It's from what I call the invisible factors. So I created a quick guide for you called 3 Ways Men Lose Influence at Work and with Women, so you can understand how these invisible factors work and what has women and colleagues both more inspired to say yes. I think you're also going to be surprised to find out the moment when your influence actually begins. So grab the guide for free at ShaynaJamesCoaching.com/3ways. That's ShaynaJamesCoaching.com/3 and the word ways, WAYS. Or you can text ALIVE to 44144. That's the word ALIVE, ALIVE, to 44144. I hope you enjoy the guide and this episode. Hello and welcome to this episode of Man Alive, and we're doing a joint episode of the Unbreakable Success podcast as well with Aaron Keith Hawkins. So I was going to say, Aaron, welcome, but we're kind of welcoming each other.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I love the dynamic though. So yes, welcome to the listeners of both podcasts. I don't think anybody should freak out because this is actually going to be, I think it's going to be a fun episode for everyone listening. So it's kind of cool to team up like this. And,
and we found each other on LinkedIn, and we both work with influence. And so, Aaron, your book is $1 Million Influence.
Yes.
And I've created a program for men called, just straight out influence.
Yeah.
So I think the topic of influence is a really powerful one, especially in this day and age, and especially with men, because I really find, and I read this in your book as well, that being able to influence others, right, is one of the foundations of being able to create a life and relationships and career that's fulfilling and meaningful and exciting, and where people are on the ride with you. Yeah. So I'm excited to talk about this and help men be able to have more influence.
Likewise, I'm with you, Shayna. It's interesting when I first started writing the book and what kind of drew my attention into the topic of influence as a topic for a book at all is the fact that it's so universal as a topic, but it's, at least in my experience, it hasn't always been a topic that people really focus on. A lot of times they'll focus on elements of influence, like relationships or leadership, both of which can lead in completely different directions from the standpoint of a conversation, but they're both aspects of influence, and they both require certain baseline skills. So I'm kind of excited to have this conversation with you and definitely learn from you and share with everybody that's listening on both sides of this conversation. It should be fun.
Yeah, good. All right. So I'm kind of thinking of where we want to dive in. And one of the pieces that I really appreciated about your book, but you can feel free to veto this, is you have 4 reasons people fail at influence.
Yes.
And I think that could be a really interesting place to start, is why people don't have more influence.
Yeah, I agree with you. I won't veto, especially since I wrote it. I got to stand by. I got to stand by it. Well, it's funny because before we started recording today, you were mentioning that the first of these 4 reasons that I wrote about where people fail at influence. The first one in my book is inattention. The lack of attention to influence is one of the reasons many people fail at influence. And it's interesting because you said in your program, you list one of the
first one.
One of the first, yes, like rules or mandates, or one of the first things people need to do is have more attention. So I thought it was pretty cool that we kind of both went at the same topic from opposite sides.
Yeah.
So I for me, here's why I listed that as one of the top reasons that I felt like people failed at influence, because there's so many times in my experience, and I come from a bit of a leadership background in law enforcement, so I'm a soon-to-be retiring police captain, and I spent 20-something years in this industry with all kinds of different leaders that I've met from all over the globe, dozens of countries. And it's funny because a lot of times when people find themselves in a position where they want to influence, whether it's in an organizational setting like that, or if it's in a household between husband and wife, I notice that a lot of times people make the mistake of tending to treat influence like a fire drill. Like, oh my gosh, something bad has happened and now I need to be influential. And that's one thing that it was a pattern that I was seeing over and over through my traditional career and through coaching, is that when people faced a crisis, they then wanted to learn, okay, how do I convince these people or this person to do these sets of things?
As opposed to, are you saying having influence all along, right?
Yes.
That it's just more of a
yes, as opposed to always paying attention to the fact that every micro decision they make is sort of setting the tone and setting the baseline for your character, your tendencies, what your expectations are, what you stand for, all those things. So I
love that. I just want to highlight what you just said, right? Your character, what was the second one? Your tendencies, what you stand for, right?
Yes, your tendencies, your character, the things that you stand for. So those things, those drops of influence are happening all day long. They're happening when people are together in relationships. They're happening in the workplace, whether you're a leader or manager or regardless of the position, you're always expressing something. And I think when we don't pay attention to that, and then suddenly we need to be expressing what we stand for, it can almost be jarring to people. Like, wait a minute, oh, that's what you believe in? I never knew that because I've never seen you express that. And that to me was why that became so important. I'm sure in your program, I'd love to hear your sort of how you go at this topic of attention in your program.
Well, right, it's interesting because this program specifically works with the invisible, I call them the invisible factors of influence, because it's beyond, I think, I imagine you'd agree, right? Beyond what we say or do.
Yes.
There's another level of influence that we're having on people. And so, people aren't just responding to our words, they're responding to our way of being, right? The below the iceberg.
Yes.
So, right. So I think about it as mastering your attention is what I talk about. And I talk about how, when you actually are able to have your attention on someone else, such that your way of listening and engaging is actually calling out deep parts of a person, which I also read in your book. So again, we're on the same page here. You're building trust when you're paying attention to someone in such a profound way, because a lot of people don't get that kind of attention. Yeah. And B, you're actually then calling out the, like I said, the deeper parts. So if you're listening in a way where you're kind of just skimming over the surface, versus you're listening in a way that calls out someone's deepest desire or what would have them be most fulfilled, or in a romantic relationship, what would have someone actually really feel excited and turned on, or in a team setting, how they would actually feel seen and collaborated with, right? When you start to listen in a way and pay attention in a way that you're noticing all of these things, then the conversation goes so much deeper, and actually so much more is possible to create together.
Yeah, I love the concept, and I think it's important because, obviously, we're talking about the topic of attention and paying attention to someone, and all of that is also part of the idea of communication. When you discuss this, when you teach that deeper level of influence, aside from just your words and actions, how do you? Are there some specifics that you go into? Because I can imagine people listening could be thinking, okay, is she talking about the energy or the intensity, tonality, body language, all those things, or is it the intention behind how much you're listening? I imagine it could be a combination of all those things. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it's both. And often what I have people start to pay attention to is the discrepancies between somebody's verbal response and then either the tone of voice or the body language, or right. So when we start to see like, oh, you just said, yes, I'd love to do that, and yet your body language is more like deflated.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? Or, right, getting a sense of asking those deeper questions. So if we're bringing in words, right, not just the level of being, then asking some of those deeper questions of, or even I noticed you answered that question really, really fast. So that has me curious, is this something you've thought about for years already? Or, is there something deeper maybe that if you gave yourself a little bit more time, you could think about also? So I don't have it that there's any right way, but just starting to really not take things at face value and seeing the subtleties that are part of our human condition that I think a lot of people just kind of pass over.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. It reminds me, I did an episode, actually, I think I just released an episode before, recently about curiosity, and what you were saying, it reminds me of that topic as an important thing, when we're giving when we're truly paying attention, not just to someone as an individual, like a conversation, but just to how we're, as you said, how we're being, and how we're expressing ourselves, and paying attention to how would other people be viewing me right now? What's my energy like? What are my expressions like? How am I walking down this hallway? And
I like that.
At face value, as silly as some of those things may sound, they make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And, I mean, we've all heard it before, and you, as you're listening and watching right now, we've all heard when people are describing someone, like, oh, what are they like? They're like, oh, they're kind of flat, they're not very outgoing, and you never really know what they're thinking because they're kind of, and then they'll describe someone else as completely different, like, oh, they just have great energy all the time. I love being around them, and those things, when we hear those things, we completely, instantly, I don't care who you are, everybody listening, when they hear that, they've heard people described in those different ways. Somebody described as flat, somebody described as having great energy. So we immediately recognize it, but it's funny because sometimes when we have these conversations like this one, when we're talking about energy or ways of being, the cynical part of the mind can sometimes go, oh, that's just, that's nonsense. But if as soon as we say a description of what we're talking about, you can get it. Like, okay, we're talking about energy and how people are seeing you, and that is a big piece of your ability to influence. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm thinking too in the realm of love, and this happens in dating, and it also happens in marriages, where when I often work in heterosexual couples or men who are wanting to be in a relationship with women, and the experience of, she just wasn't that into me, or she's not really into having sex anymore, or our the spark has faded. And oftentimes when you ask a woman why that's happened, they'll say, I have 3 responses I think women often give. It's like, when you say, how did it feel to be with him? There's either like, that felt really great, and I felt connected. I felt, all these things. And then there's kind of like, I'm not really sure. And then it's more the like, didn't work. Yeah. And oftentimes when I speak to women, they don't necessarily have the words to back all of that up. So that's why I think it's such an interesting topic, because I think there's so much subtlety. It's like, you and I have spent a lot of time in the realm of hashing out what we're actually talking about and why people have the responses and the reactions that they have.
Sure.
I do think in the general population, it can more just be on the surface level of like, I don't really know. I just know I wasn't feeling it, right? And when you feel a leader, you feel their power, their presence. Right?
Yeah, sure. And like you said earlier, you mentioned something something I think you mentioned that I want to bring up again because it's very important. We were talking about this, and you're saying I don't think there's a right or wrong way to look at this concept of being and things of that nature. I think to the point of the topic. It's about paying attention to it, because there are certainly phenomenal leaders that aren't outgoing or boisterous. They're more reserved.
Yeah.
And then there are phenomenal leaders who you just can't keep them quiet because they're always spewing, their ideas and their thoughts and their insights and trying new things. And neither one is wrong. I mean, as great part of the human experience is having all these different types of people, because we need all of those different types of energies. But I think as long as we're being authentic and aware of who it is we're being, and that we're being our own sense, we're expressing our own sense of identity and authenticity.
I appreciate that point, right? That you can be an influencer,
sure,
whether you're extroverted, introverted, quiet, loud, right? Any of those ways, that it's actually not about some, single template or what you have to look like. But, right, so paying attention feels like one of those main pieces where then you actually get to engage in a more powerful dynamic with people. And I think people then also, it starts to build trust and respect, and that people are more likely to follow you or support you when they really feel seen and understood, which was also in your book, right? Maybe we could talk a little bit about the trilogy of needs, because that was a big part of what you wrote about. Yeah,
sure. It's interesting. You were mentioning about the fact that you can be an influencer, a highly influential person, and either be an introvert or an extrovert or some combination of the two. And it's funny because in my experience over the years that I've been doing this type of thing, this coaching and working with other people who are coaches, influencers, speakers, authors, workshop leaders, all that kind of thing, many of the people on the big stages that I've connected with, they're very introverted in their day-to-day life. But when it's time for them to teach the topics that they love, it's not that they're putting on an act. It's almost like it's game time. Suddenly there's this I hate to be cliche, but it's like their purpose. It's time for them to express their purpose and what they love to do, and energy comes out. So I think it's important to recognize and honor that. But to get to the topic you're talking about, the Trilogy of Human Needs, which is a framework in my book, Million Dollar Influence. It's something that was a work in progress, a framework about. I wanted to try to simplify as best I could in my experience what people need, or I think the reason I first started noticing it is what is often missing when people are feeling unfulfilled or feeling less than. And from there, kind of reverse engineering that, and certainly by through my studies in grad school, etc., and I have my master's was in leadership. But during that time, I did a lot of reading about human needs theories. Mine certainly isn't the only one. Probably most people listening, if they've heard any discussion about human needs, Tony Robbins has a very popular one. He's got a list of 6 human needs that he discusses a lot. But his work stemmed from other people like Paul Seitz and other researchers, where he got his from. Anyway, mine was broken down into 3 categories, and the 3 categories are survival needs. The second category is self-awareness needs, and the third is transcendent needs. Transcendent just meaning above and beyond the normal experience. And what I noticed was, and I'd love to get your input on the survival needs, there's 3 of them, and it's the need for security, for relation or connection, relationships, and the need for relevance. I was trying to think of the word. I know it's my own book, and the word was escaping me. The need for relevance. Yeah. So security, relation, and relevance. And it's interesting because over the course of my traditional career in law enforcement, whenever I would see these a lot of really horrific things happen, or relationships breaking down, the fights, the arguments, you can imagine during the course of normal that career, you wind up seeing a lot of people in crisis. Almost every single occasion, there was an attempt to satisfy one of those needs, or those needs were missing. So if you can imagine two people in a disagreement or an argument, a lot of things that almost every time someone doesn't feel safe or secure, they don't feel connected, and oftentimes the top one is they don't feel like they matter, they don't feel relevant.
Yep.
And when that's missing, if any of those are missing in either a relationship, whether it's intimate relationship, personal relationship, or in a work setting or peer-to-peer relationship, if the people you're attempting to influence and interact with, if they don't feel safe, they don't feel connected to you, and they don't feel like they matter,
right, nothing else is going to happen.
That's a non-starter at that point.
Yeah.
So those needs are unconditional. The other needs, the self-awareness needs and transcendent needs, are important. But starting from there, if we don't have those three, if you're not connecting with people and the people in your relationship, I'll say to anybody, if you're having a struggle in any type of relationship, ask yourself I'm sure you heard of people coming to you with their problem. I can't connect with so-and-so, or I can't connect with him or her or them. The first things I always ask, like, how safe are you making? How safe would they feel around you? How connected do they feel with you? And how much do they feel like you think they matter?
Right. It's so powerful. I mean, I'm thinking too, another part of my program is I call it getting someone's world. And so it's really looking at, right, how do you, and it builds on mastering your attention, of course, right? Sure. How do you really understand someone? And so when you really look at those survival needs and what people are at a fundamental level reacting from, right? Because we're not usually reacting about the thing on the surface that we think. I remember
it's a symptom.
Right. I remember growing up and watching my parents fight about the garbage constantly. Like, who's going to take out the garbage? And I just had that sense, like, you people are not talking about the garbage. You don't feel understood and respected in this way, and you don't feel seen and valued in this way. And so then we have all these surface expressions, right? But I love how you bring this up, because I think the way to have the least amount of influence possible, right, is to try to look around those things, or to try to get our point across when we haven't actually heard somebody else's point. Or I had a teacher once who said, listen fully, even though you probably feel like you're going to die. And then once you listen fully and acknowledged your partner, then say your piece, right? Because really influence someone unless they actually feel heard first.
It's so true, and I'm sure everyone, as you're listening, you've probably heard one of the, or maybe participated in one of those conversations where somebody, maybe somebody was getting their point across or expressing their side of the situation or their version of events, and the other person immediately says, "Okay, I'll let you talk now. Listen to me." What does that mean? That means I let you get it out. I wasn't listening to it.
I didn't hear you.
But I allowed you to speak, and now it's my turn to speak. And that is very much, a symptom of, or a symbolic of those moments where someone is listening, but they're not really paying attention. They're just listening to vent out of courtesy.
Right,
as
which
opposed
leads to realize, even more how powerful the topic of influence is, because not only does it have a person start to consider others and who they are and what they're being driven by and all that, but it actually has us have to pay attention to our actions and how we're impacting people and the effect we have on people, and to really wake up to that.
Yeah, and it's so universally important. I know I mentioned that earlier, but this literally makes differences in job interviews and attempting to get interviews, or trying to get connections with other influences. If you're writing a proposal for a book and you're pitching a book to a publisher, all of that requires influence. And the reason I say that is because somebody who, let's just use the book pitching example. If somebody's pitching a book to a publisher, they can write a phenomenal story or a phenomenal book, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, put together a proposal, I's dotted, T's crossed, and everything looks great, and they could pitch it. But if they're pitching it from a place to explain how great their project is. They may or may not break through the ice. Whereas if somebody else is pitching, they could write the same book, but if they write theirs or they express themselves, and through the entire time they're keeping in the mind, what would this publisher want? Who are they trying to reach? What are their interests? What are their concerns? What are their likely what are their fears when it comes to giving somebody a writing contract and then it turning to, fizzling out, it being a bust? What are they worried about? And writing that pitch and selling the book from the place of making sure you address the concerns and needs of that publisher, you're going to get two different results. Because they're going to read one and they're going to say, okay, this sounds good. They certainly feel proud of their book and confident about it. But the other one, like, oh, they get us. They understand what we're looking for. They understand our concerns, and they're addressing, if not all, they're addressing many of our concerns. This looks This looks promising. Yeah. Because it goes back to that publisher is far more likely to feel a little bit safer about that one. They certainly feel like they matter because the person submitting it has thought about them, and they feel some connection. Like this person was interested enough to learn about what we need and what we're worried about. So let's continue the conversation.
Yes, so, I love it. It leads me to think about romantic relationship too, where we can have a desire for connection or more romance or just to feel affection or whatever it may be. And so often I've heard, one partner say, I really want this. And another partner comes up with, but I don't have this yet. Right. Or like, I haven't heard you pay attention to my needs. Yeah. So I don't actually feel open to giving you your needs. I mean, it can become a stalemate in that way because both people, are stuck in that place. I mean, I often think about it, and I've often wanted to write a book called Same Team Marriage. Yeah. Or like instead of actually being on opposing teams, people are, if I help you get your need met, then you're going to help me get my need met, and we're actually on the same team here, right?
Yeah, I love that. I love, write down that title because that's awesome. I love that, Same Team Marriage. That is so awesome, and it's so true because and I don't know. I'd love to hear your perspective on this. I've often heard in relationships people talking about like, oh, relationships are 50-50, and I've always kind of grinded my teeth when I would hear people say that because, to be honest, I think most of the time a lot of people look at their relationships as 50-50, meaning like they only need to give half. Yeah, and it never works that way. No. And to your point, a lot of times, whether it's about intimacy or attention or respect or anything, people feel like they can only go halfway until the other person meets them. Right. And that almost never works to wait for the other half to be willing to go all out. And to me, it comes down to identity. Like, who are you actually, and how authentic are you? What are your values? How do you want to show up in a relationship? Because if you're holding back and you're not being, let's use the word caring, you're not being as caring as you would like to be because you don't think your partner isn't being caring enough yet, then you're not even being yourself. Yeah. Like you're intentionally holding back. You're not even being yourself. And it cheats everybody. It cheats the individual that's holding back, and it cheats the partner because they think, I got a partner who half cares. Right. And it hurts both halves. And everybody's going to have their down days, but I like to subscribe to the idea of just go all in for two reasons. Number one, if you go all in and you just be as loving, caring, compassionate, empathetic as you truly want to be, all in. I mean, hit that 9 or 10 on the 1 to 10 scale. Yeah. What will happen if you're with the right person is over time they will reciprocate.
Yes, that's what starts to come back. Like equal opposite pressure.
They'll reciprocate, and they will. The law of reciprocation is real. Yeah. And it may take a moment. I get it. If somebody's been in a really rough relationship for years, okay, if you're really good for one afternoon, it's probably not going to change things. Right. But it may take time. It may take a few weeks.
In a little bit like, let me tell you this
it may not be immediate, but if you're willing to be authentic and go all in for a week, a few weeks, a month, a couple months, and you're meeting those needs as I discussed in my book, and as you discuss them, it makes a massive difference. It's got to be 100% on both sides, or at least with the intention of being all in on both sides.
We're not going to be perfect. It's not going to be 100% all the time. But if we don't influence from hesitance, and we don't influence from waiting for somebody else to give us something that we want before we give, right? Which goes back to one of the pieces you had around generosity, that people fail to achieve influence because there's more of this selfish way of looking at the world. And so that the generosity, I often see when clients come in, and especially when I work with men, and they're like, okay, I want women to see me, or I want women, and they don't exactly say it like that, right? But it's like, I want to be wanted. I want women to be attracted to me.
Sure.
And I often have them start to give what they want to receive first. It's like, okay, well, go out there and, start to appreciate people, start to appreciate women, and let them know how they're lighting up your day, right? Or what you're feeling in their presence. And then suddenly you're going to be on their radar, right? And for people who've been married too for a long time, like one of the things that tends to slide off of the menu is appreciation.
Sure.
And when people are feeling appreciated and seen, right, as we've been talking about in different ways, and influence is not happening.
Yeah, it's so true. And generosity, since we were going over this list, we started out talking about this, about top 4 reasons people fail at influence. Number 2 is a lack of generosity. To Shana's point, as you're listening, the lack of generosity, it's so true. And a lot of times in relationships at work and home, a lot of times influence tends to, or relationships, a lot of times I see it's like a reward system. Right. If you're good enough, then I'll be... I'll give you this attention. I'll give you this respect. Then I'll listen. But that's not how it works. It's certainly not how it works in business or life anymore. People should and do expect more. That's just the way relationships work. Yeah. If you're generous and you're just being, again, for me, it falls back to identity. I always tell people there's no bigger motivator than identity, and who you actually believe yourself to be. If you believe you are something, you don't need to be motivated to do it. I use a simple story when my wife and I we found out we were expecting. She was expecting our daughter, and we went through. It was this excitement because it took us a couple of years for for her to be able to conceive. So that was a challenge. And then when it finally happened, it was like, oh my gosh, there's a baby all the way. So we're shopping and painting the bedroom, and I'm putting in new outlets and all this whirlwind of excitement for months. And then she was born. And then she did what babies do, which was stay up half of the night screaming and crying, and we weren't getting any sleep. Yeah. And my point of the story is when she first came home, it was exciting staying up all night and feed, because I would get up with my wife Kathy, and we would get up and we'd feed her at 2, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and it was fun. But then when the lack of sleep kicked in, then it wasn't exciting anymore. That sense of motivation faded, and now we were doing it because we had to. And the point is, and every parent or anybody can relate that type of responsibility to something that you've experienced in your own life. But the point is, when you're for us and for many people, when you're a parent, you don't have to be motivated to feed your child. Right. You feed them because that's who you are as in your identity. Parents feed their kids. Parents care for the kids. Parents hold their children when they're crying. That's an identity issue. You don't need a motivational speech or a self-help book to say, I'm going to get motivated so I can feed the baby. I just don't. It's so ridiculous, but it's true. Yeah. But I think if we can embrace that as people and carry that with us as we're being who we are at home and in our relationships and in the workplace, and even with our friends and peers and our social circles, if we can remember who we are as a sense of identity, then we don't need to be motivated to do what we should be doing.
And one of the other ways you talked about it was that people fail at influence because they're valuing personality over practice, which
Yes.
I think what I'm hearing is personality is different from identity in the way I see it. And I think the way you're talking about it, right? Like personality are those kind of, the shallower parts of us that we just I think often people let run the show.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And, one of the things I've been thinking, because I work with often men who have been divorced and they're starting over. And, in some ways it's so challenging to start over again. It's exciting, but it's also really challenging. But I also feel like one of the beautiful parts of it is we get to be more mature. Like I think sometimes in relationship people can get to a certain level of maturity, right? And then like you were saying, you don't really want to mature more until your partner matures more. There's like this, I'll do it more than you
It's
do
true.
it. And right. And so part of what I'm really appreciating about this conversation too is the focus on being an influencer, has a lot to do with being a mature human being.
Yeah.
And being willing to grow up and take some of those needs that, I'm not saying to set, I think men and women both can set aside their needs. So I'm not saying that we need to set aside our core fundamental needs, but there is a way that we can be kind of like whiny toddlers in certain times about like, well, I need this, and you're going to give me this, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to how do we mature that conversation to be like, okay, I do have a need for connection and it's not happening here. And I'm not going to settle for it not happening here. I'm going to stand for the fact that, this is an important value in my life. And then I'm going to consider what makes it more likely for me to get this? What makes it more likely for this to start happening in my life? Is it me throwing a temper tantrum and acting like a toddler? Or is it like, oh, okay, I'm going to come to this from a more mature perspective, right? From that deeper identity that you're talking about.
Yeah. And to your point, the more likely scenario is if the more you begin to give that sense of connection, then you'll get it.
Yeah.
I mean, you get that sense of connection from giving it and being intentional about making someone else feel connected.
Yeah.
And then you get it right back. You immediately get the benefit. You immediately get the benefit of it, and it's pretty cool how that works out both ways. It's like self-fulfilling. With all those needs, like the three survival needs we talked about, the need for security, relation, and relevance. If you make somebody feel secure, and you make somebody, and if it's your intention to help someone feel secure and help someone feel related with and connected to, and make them feel like they matter, and make them feel relevant. When you do that, you feel the same thing.
Yeah.
You feel safer in that relationship, and you feel more connected in that relationship, and you feel like, wow, that's pretty cool. I was able to influence this relationship, and they feel so much better about themselves because of what I was willing to express to them, how I was willing to treat them.
Yeah.
You provide your own gifts by giving them. It's pretty cool.
Right.
Yeah.
Just thinking the last one we didn't cover so far of the 4 reasons people fail at influence that you wrote was the lack of boundaries. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to what that is for you.
Yes, definitely. And to touch on how you talked about real quick about valuing personality over practice. My quick premise on that is a lot of times people use the story of that they're not the type who are influential. And I like to remind people that influence is a skill. It's not a personality trait. It's absolutely a skill. Regardless of what your personality is like, influence is a skill that can be learned. Yeah. I just want to make sure people get that as well, because it can be hard if you're not used to it.
No, that's actually really powerful. I mean, it's one of those things, too, where men sometimes come to me and that, like the idea of chemistry or confidence or influence, like as though you have to be born with it. And I completely agree, right? I love supporting men to develop and tap into that place where the influence comes from, the confidence comes from, the power comes from.
Yeah, definitely. It's a developmental process. So yeah, the one we didn't touch on was lack of boundaries being one of the top 4 reasons people fail at influence. And it's funny because we were just talking a minute ago about generosity. Yeah. And then now the discussion goes to boundaries, which may seem like it's a conflict, and which is why it's fun to write, because you get to piss people off. Wait a minute. But the truth is, regardless of how generous we are, we also have to have boundaries. Mm-hmm. I tend to think, I love your take on this, I tend to think of boundaries as being a values issue. Uh-huh. Not necessarily, I'm not putting up with you and I'm not putting up with you. To me, it's less about that, and it's more about values and character. In other words, being able to be confident about what you're willing to allow in your life. Uh-huh. From a character standpoint, from a values standpoint, and letting people know what it is you stand for and what you're willing to participate in, what you're willing to tolerate, and being able to stand up and say something when you see something that conflicts with your values, and say, I love you, but this isn't right, and it's not something I want to be involved in, and I'm not going to do it. Whether it's drama, whether it's abuse or mental abuse, verbal abuse, or whether it's racial injustice, social injustice. If nobody knows what you're standing for, and nobody knows a friend of mine was able to meet, Dov Baron. I love the way he put it. He said, "You got to be willing to let people know, like, what hill are you willing to die on? Like, this is my stance, and no matter what, this is what I stand for. Take me or leave me." And I think that's an important. It's an important thing for people to remember. You have to be able to set boundaries when it comes to your character, and not from a place that's. I think it's important for us to spell out that it's not from a place of ego.
Yes.
Like, I'm above this or above that. I think it needs to come somewhat from a place of humility. Yeah. Of like, look, this is what's important to me, and this is how I feel about people and values and character, and this is where I stand. And I think a lot of people compromise a bit too much, and compromise over a series of time, and then it gets to a place where there's like a tipping point, and then they don't want to compromise anymore, and suddenly they're saying, "This is my values."
Right.
And really a year has gone by, or 2 years has gone by, or God forbid, a decade has gone by, and someone has been tolerating something that has been conflicting with their values the whole time, and suddenly they raise their hand and stand up for themselves, and then it just comes off as disingenuous.
Well, right, and it comes out. I mean, I'm one of those people who I'm working on this, and it's much better than it used to be. But I've been a tolerator, and so then tolerators explode eventually, right? Which is not a way to influence people, right? And I'm just thinking about. I mean, one of the things that feels important to me about boundaries that I like to work with people on is how to set clear boundaries without, without having to push people away, right? I mean, the reality is if you set a boundary, someone may move farther away because they have to stand behind the boundary. But there's a way, like you said, when you do it with humility versus when you do it with aggression, or when you do it with an assumption that someone has actually crossed one of your boundaries because they want to hurt you or they want to get back at you, or versus when you actually have assumptions about people like, oh, I think that person is doing the best he or she can do. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's something I actually haven't communicated, right, about what works for me, doesn't work for me. Yeah. And I'm going to let this person know, and I'm also going to get curious, bringing back curiosity, right, to see like, it seems like we have a disagreement here, or a difference in values, or it seems like, maybe I set this boundary, or I said no to something, and you did it again, and I'm kind of curious, like, did you realize that you were doing it, or what's having you do that, right? So those conversations, when we actually come from humility and assuming the best about people and curiosity, I find go much better than if just assuming the worst, assuming malintent. Yes. Right? Yeah. And not taking the time to really see, oh, there's another human being over there that's coming from their own suffering or wounding, whatever. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing the thing that they're doing.
Yeah. It's brilliant, and it's so true. Like communication is so big, and what I find interesting when it comes to boundaries, and again, we're talking about this is a developmental thing, right? So these are skills that over time, these are relationship skills and influence skills that over time can be developed. And what I found a lot of times is when it comes to boundaries, a lot of times, in some occasions, our examples sometimes more powerful or more effective than our words. Just to use a simple example of being at a I don't know, a small gathering at dinner or out at a restaurant with a group of people, and a conversation is going on that you don't agree with, whether it's gossip about somebody or some drama, and you just steer the conversation in a different direction. You just talk about something different, something progressive, something that, a mentally stimulating conversation or something. And just by being the leader in that case, you don't have to scold the table and say, wait a minute, guys, we're not going to talk about so-and-so, they're not even here. Just steer the conversation in a different direction. And people pick up on that. Yeah. Especially, especially if you're confident about it and you're not kind of wishy-washy about it. It's a great way to influence is to pace a situation and lead it in direction where you want to go.
I like that too, right? Lead it in a direction where you want to go, and lead it in a direction where it's like more good for more people, right?
Yeah, and I've seen it play out so many times, and I've been at the other end of it, where maybe I was involved in a conversation I shouldn't have been, or we're entertaining a topic I shouldn't have been, and somebody else has stepped in, and it's almost like it's kind of jarring, like, well, and it's completely unspoken. A lot of times it's very unconscious. Right.
That's like, I love that. The invisible piece of it.
Yes. Yeah. Like you talked about earlier, very invisible, very unconscious, but it goes down to, and again, it being a boundaries issue if you have people that share your values in your life, and if that is one of your boundaries, and that's the type of thing that will happen, you'll be able to be influenced by those people, and they'll be influenced by you.
Yeah. I love this. I love this conversation, and I'm just noticing time and thinking maybe we can each kind of wrap up with something we want for listeners around their ability to influence, or something that we just feel like, okay, if I didn't say this, this would be missing from this conversation.
Yeah, I'm going to let you go, and I'm going to pick up on.
I'm happy if you have something right there. Go for it.
Okay. Where am I going to go with this? We talked about so much about these reasons people fail at influence. I think if there's one thing I would want people to take away from this, I think it's the development piece. Because a lot of times, whether it's an entrepreneur that's just starting out, or somebody in a new relationship, or maybe in an old relationship that is getting more frustrating over time, or somebody in a workplace that's a leader or responsible for people and are having a hard time, I think if there's one thing I want people to take away, because we talked about so much, so I don't feel the need to pile on some more thoughts for people to try to process. It's to remember that influence is a developmental process. It's a skill that I'm certainly still learning and trying to improve upon, and it's a skill that you, as you're listening and watching, are still learning. And be patient with yourself. And I think if we walked away with the word curiosity, like you brought up earlier, Shana, it's a phenomenal word, is to be patient with yourself and be curious about what you're doing and what results you're getting. And then if the results aren't what you like, start thinking about alternatives. And certainly, by people reaching out to you, Shana, and working with you, or grabbing a copy of my book, either way, if you stay curious about it and learn from some people who talk about the topic like you and I, and be patient, I think it'll go a long way. Just be willing to develop over time. Yeah.
I love that. I'm thinking, okay, what do I want for people? I mean, all right, I don't need to add anything else on either, but I think maybe just the reminder of how influence can be in some ways really subtle and invisible.
Sure.
And yet at the same time, so loud, right? So what we think is subtle, or what we think people aren't paying attention to, people are paying attention. And so, when you walk into a room, depending on how you actually look at people and It's how you feel about them. And if you're harboring resentment toward men, women, or people of any gender or any race, right? Or if you have actually done the work, like you're saying in the development, if you've done the work to go deeper than those surface personality layers and actually finding the shared humanity in people, and having these conversations with people about their bigger visions and what's meaningful for them, right? Like the more you take the time, I think, to really get to know people, and to get to know people from curiosity and from assuming the best, as opposed to assuming some kind of malintent, or there's a difference here and we're not going to, find common ground.
Sure.
To me, the more it feels like it's actually easy and natural to influence people. And I think people trust us because we have a stance of, like you were saying, I value you, right? I value you, and I'm not trying to manipulate you. I'm actually trying to influence a situation where what I want happens and what you want happens, and we find the win-win here, right? We find common ground.
I love that. That's brilliant. I love what you said. I love it so much I want to repeat it again, that a lot of times the most subtle and little things that we do have the most impact. And who has not been there where someone has walked into a room and immediately it either makes something a lot better or a lot worse without a word being...
It can be a glance, it can be a breath, it can be anything. It's just like amazing how quickly...
And to come full circle from where we began this conversation, that's about paying attention.
Yes.
Like you said, paying attention is the number one key, because when you're paying attention, you'll be far more likely to control those little things that make that big impact. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much, Shana, for connecting with me and having this conversation. I would love to do this again down the line and continue a conversation like this or something else. But I appreciate it, and thanks so much for doing the work you do. It makes such a huge impact.
Yeah, I appreciate you, and I know we didn't get into your story, but I appreciate the kind of the awakening that you had that allowed you to really see the depth of life and influence. So thank you for doing the work too.
I appreciate it. For listeners of Unbreakable Success, if you want to get links to Shana and all her contacts, I'll be sure we'll connect, and I'll get them all linked up on the website. So if you're on AaronKeithHawkins.com, if you go to the search bar and just type Shana, Shana, am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Shana, type Shana in the search bar, and then it gets you all linked up so that you can follow up with her, find out where she's at on social media and her website, and see the work that she's doing. I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to reach out to you in that way. I appreciate you.
I'm so glad you joined us for today's episode of Man Alive. I hope it gives you a sense of what's possible and how good your life can be. If you like what you heard, I'd be so grateful for you to subscribe to Man Alive and write a quick review that helps men like you find us. And again, head over to shanajamescoaching.com/manalive to get outtakes, videos, and raw footage I only share there. These are some of the most interesting parts of these expert conversations. You can also grab your copy of The Unknown Power to accelerate your career and solidify your confidence with women, because the two are related, and I know you don't have to settle for one or the other. Join us each week for a new episode of Man Alive.